Gene Simmons and his family were reality TV royalty back in the 2000s, but we haven't actually heard much about them in a while. But it's not like their lives just stopped along with their reality show. They've all been up to a lot, and it's time for a catch-up. Listen closely because this story is pretty surprising. We were all used to knowing everything about the Simmons family's lives, but that all stopped when the TV show ended in 2012. Nowadays, many people just don't know what's really going on with them at all. The obvious question here is what actually ended up happening with Gene and Shannon's relationship. The two of them had a whole storyline on the show. They'd obviously been together since the 80s, but they only got married toward the end of the show's run. It was actually a whole 28 years into their relationship that they finally tied the knot. But soon after that, the show ended, and we didn't get to see whether anything changed between them in the years after they got married. But if you were rooting for Gene and Shannon back then, today is your lucky day. The two of them are actually very much still together and happy, but they're also slowly getting older. Gene is already in his 70s, but he's still busy touring with his group Kiss. But his health is actually starting to be a concern. There was a health scare moment that happened on the tour pretty recently. At one point, when Gene and his bandmates were on stage in Brazil, it became obvious that Gene really wasn't feeling well. He actually had to sit down, and the concert had to be interrupted so that he could get his bearings again. But luckily, he actually started feeling better pretty soon and was able to finish the concert. But the incident really had everyone worried about his well-being. Many people thought that he should probably be taking things easier, and it also wasn't obvious what had caused the incident. But luckily, Gene was able to confirm later that it actually wasn't a big deal. He just really felt ill for a moment because of dehydration and heat. He obviously hadn't been drinking enough water, and Brazil is a pretty hot place. But the important part was that it wasn't any sort of underlying condition or illness causing the issue. But either way, Gene's actually about to start taking things easier pretty soon. This tour is actually Kiss's last ever tour. It was actually supposed to finish back in 2021, but it got delayed because of the pandemic. But now that the restrictions have lifted, it's back in full swing again. And Kiss's last show ever is actually scheduled for this December. So if everything goes well this time, Gene should be able to retire at the end of this year. As for Shannon, she's actually pretty much retired already. She used to be a model and an actress back in the day, but the harsh reality is she's just not getting as many jobs now that she's older. This is actually a big problem with older people, especially women. It's just much harder for them to get acting jobs. But Shannon has been busy in other ways too. Age has actually been catching up to her as well. She apparently just can't stop getting injured. It's never anything really that big, but she always shares pictures of her injuries on her Instagram. She broke both her ankle and her hand on 2 separate occasions, and she's also had surgery to have a cyst removed from her face. But other than that, she seems to be doing pretty well. Besides her injuries, she also shares pictures of her dogs. She has a bunch of them, and she actually recently got a new puppy, so she's definitely busy taking care of them. So far, it's been mostly good news about Gene and Shannon, but there's actually some pretty heartbreaking stuff too. At least if you were a big fan of Gene Simmons' family jewels back in the day. Gene and Shannon actually sold their huge house that the show was filmed in. This happened back in 2021. They initially listed the house for $25 million, but ended up selling it for just $16 million. According to Gene, it was just time for a change of lifestyle. At least that's what he said. He and Shannon were actually going to move out of California, but in the end, they ended up staying there just in a different house. But the move really signified the end of an era for them. The life that we saw them have on the show is finally over now, but they still have each other, and they still have their kids, even though they both just fully have their own lives now. Their son Nick has actually been laying pretty low as of late. He's dabbled in several things over the years, but he mainly works as a writer. He mostly writes pieces for newspapers now, but that wasn't always the case. He was actually going to go into creating comic books, but that was until everything came crashing down for him when he was exposed for plagiarism. He actually had a comic series coming out, but it only had 3 parts out when accusations started coming out about him. As his comic was gaining traction, people started noticing some similarities to other works. First of all, he was accused of copying the story of the famous manga Bleach, and you could say that there are just always going to be stories similar to each other since there are so many. But Nick was also accused of copying the art in his comics too. Pretty much every single element of the art, the poses, the characters was actually similar to art that people shared on the website DeviantArt, and the similarities were so bad that there was no way Nick was escaping the accusations. He actually didn't really try to hide them, and he admitted to using other people's arts and stories as inspiration. He even apologized for the whole thing, but that still doesn't make his comic any less plagiarized, and there was no way it could continue from that point on. The publisher ended up discontinuing the series, and Nick changed his focus to writing for magazines and newspapers. This all went down a pretty long while ago. It was actually while the show was still going on, although it wasn't really shown. Nick has been pretty scandal-free since then, but Gene and Shannon's daughter Sophie is actually even less controversial than her brother. The hottest news about her is that she actually got married earlier this year. She's been dating her now husband, James, for years, so it wasn't a surprise that they decided to get married. They had about 50 guests at their wedding, all friends and family. That's actually pretty small, especially for a celebrity family, but this is actually a theme for the whole family. They just aren't the kind to lean into extravagance, even though they definitely would have the money for it. Sophie actually uses her celebrity status and privilege for a lot of good things. She actually has her own charity called Sophie's Place. They help kids in difficult situations involving harm, and kids who have had adults do inappropriate things to them, which is obviously a really worthy cause. But aside from that, she's actually pursuing music just like her dad. But the thing about Sophie is, she actually didn't want to go into music at first. She knew that she would be compared to her dad with every step she took in that direction, and she didn't want to be seen as someone who just does whatever her parents did. But at some point she realized that music truly is her passion. She had actually been writing songs her whole life, so it was an obvious choice to do it professionally too. But she's not trying to jump into the industry head first. She released her first single back in 2015, and a couple more after that in 2018. Most recently, she actually featured on a new single by Alan Walker. So she's definitely still still actively working on music, but we still haven't had an album from her. It seems that for now, she's still just more focused on her charitable activities, but you never know what might happen next. And a Sophie album could be right around the corner for all we know. Anyway, what do you guys think? Do you think we'll hear more of Sophie's music soon? And what do you think about where Jean is now? Let me know in the comments below.